Welcome to The Way We Roll with me, Simon Minty.
And me, Phil Friend.
Our guest this month is Dr. Nancy Doyle. Nancy is a well-recognized organizational psychologist. She's a social entrepreneur and leading authority on neurodiversity and disability inclusion in the workplace.
Nancy created Genius Within, community interest company, a hugely successful organization pioneering scalable, evidence-based solutions that empower neurodivergent individuals and transform organizational cultures.
In addition to this, she's a visiting professor at Birkbeck University of London, where she co-founded the Centre for Neurodiversity at Work. Her work supports neurodivergent PhD students to further our knowledge around neuro-inclusive practice.
And on the Genius Within website, it says of you, Nancy, you are a proud neuro minority, passionate about improving the way neurodiversity is treated in the workplace. And we hear neurodiversity in quotes a lot. What does it actually mean in a workplace context? And what is neuro minority? So over to you, Nancy. Why don't you kick us off by helping us with those two questions?
I absolutely can. And to be honest, language around any marginalized population is a topic in and of itself, and we could spend an hour talking about it. So I'll give you the brief answer, but I'll also caveat it by saying language and terminology evolves with inclusion movements for very good reasons. And sometimes people get very stuck about whether or not they're using the right word. And this actually holds people back from having conversations. And I think, people in the community feel quite strongly about different terms and how they're used. And that's absolutely right. That's their identity. But I think just as a woman can identify as gay, lesbian, or queer, people can identify as they want within the neurodiversity and use the terms about themselves how they want. And I think it should be easy for us to just respect that. So I will share the way I understand these terms, and the caveat is if you're interested in inclusion and if you're interested in a bit allyship towards the neurodiversity community, pay attention because people do use words differently. But I don't think that's any different to the fact that people use words differently in race inclusion and in LGBTQ inclusion. So, neurodiversity as a word is basically a description of humans. Humans are neurodiverse. All of us, the way our brains work, the way our neurocognitive structures manifest, that is diverse. So any two people will have differences in the way that they think, in the way that their brain chemistry works, in the various connections between their brain regions. That diversity exists in the same way that biodiversity is a property of the globe, if that makes sense. So in context of work, neurodiversity is a description of the fact that in any organization, people will think differently. Not people aren't thinking the same way. Then we're not automatons. And that is of interest. And in fact, a lot of workplace success is devoted to going, what kind of thinkers are best for this kind of job? What kind of thought processes suit this project? What kind of expression and communication do we need in order to meet this target, get this sales across the line, build this relationship, support this individual? So neurodiversity is always relevant to the world and to the workplace, and has always been. Now, within that idea of neurodiversity, there is also the idea of neurodivergence, which is where people have an unusual neurotype that is quite different from the norm. So there is a sort of normal distribution of cognitive abilities. People are good at verbal skills, processing speed, memory, visual spatial reasoning, abstract reasoning, problem solving, writing, numeracy at different levels. The majority of the human population are much of a muchness for all of those different abilities. So if you plotted their scores on a graph, it would be a kind of, middle of the line, a bit better here at memory, maybe a bit poorer here at literacy, but much of a muchness. A neurodivergent person is someone who has got big disparities between the things they do really, really well and the things that they struggle with. So, for example, in my own profile, I'm in the top whatever percent, very high percent of the population for visual spatial reasoning, and my working memory is pants. So there's a very big difference between the potential. If I'm using my brain in the way that suits my brain, I can do great things. And if I'm trying to make my brain do something else, I fall over and I get really stuck. So the level of disparity between those strengths and challenges is what defines someone as neurodivergent. And neurodivergence is associated with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Tourette syndrome, but also can be kind of acquired. So you can end up with these big disparities if you are experiencing a significant mental health condition, if you have had a brain injury, or if you've got a chronic health neurological condition, you can end up with big disparities as well. There's no one policing the borders. There's no one that gives you permission to have your neurodivergence card. And then the reason I use neurominority is because minority is kind of it's got a more political association, the idea of fighting for minority rights. We are a minority. Neurodivergent people comprise sort of 15 to 20% of the population. So that is a minority, but it's a significant minority. And the way that the world is set up isn't for people with spiky profiles, it's for people with flat profiles. So if you think about the way we incentivize schools, we want schools to make sure that everyone gets 5 A to C grades, or 5 to 9 grades, whatever they are now. So we're incentivizing normality, we're incentivizing generalist thinking, and we're promoting and prioritizing generalist thinking. Whereas neurodivergent people who aren't going to get 5 A to C grades, they might get 2 A stars and 3 Ds, though we are challenged by that world. And so the neurodiversity movement is partially a movement to argue for, legitimize the rights of people who are going to lose their flow and their joie de vivre and their purpose in life if we try and squish them into the 5 A to C grades box, rather than going, do you know those 2 A star things that you do that. So that's kind of that is the shortest possible answer I can give to that. We could also write 5,000 word essays on it, book chapters, etc., etc.
It's really helpful as well. I need to apologize to Phil because I said something different when we were prepping for the show. So your point is neurodiversity is everybody, but neurodivergent, the people it has a significant impact on in as you said, that sort of up and down skills. So now forgive me because I think this is I feel like I'm turning into Reform or Daily Mail, but the what is perceived as a great increase of people with diagnosis, and the bit that I quite like is the younger people being diagnosed and then the parents going, oh hello, that's me, I didn't realize.
Well, no, what normally happens is the developmental interview. So the clinician is saying, so, let's talk about your developmental milestones. Let's talk about what you were like as a child. And they're sort of finding out, could you ride a bike? Could you tie your shoelaces up? Were you, buzzing around the place and unable to sit down? And the parents are going, well, yes, they did all those things, but that's completely normal, isn't it? Oh. Oh, it's not completely normal to not use any word other than the word this before you're 5. Okay, right.
And what do you think, whether it's an increase or just an acknowledgement, what is behind the diagnosis? Is there a downside to this, or is it a positive thing?
I think I've got 2 questions, so I'd like to get to the positive thing, but can we just start with the rising diagnosis thing? I think there's some debunking that needs to go on there.
Right.
So if you break down there is a huge rise in diagnoses of ADHD and autism, particularly. We're not seeing a huge rise in dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, by the way. Those are not cool at the moment, and no one's diagnosing them because they're not cool. They were very cool in the 90s. Then autism became very cool, and now ADHD is very cool. So there's some issues there, which are another entire podcast. But the rise in diagnosis of ADHD and autism, it is true. Numbers have gone up dramatically. But if you break down those numbers demographically, what you will find it is middle-aged women driving a lot of that. And the reason it is middle-aged women driving a lot of that is because women were missed as children, hugely missed as children. And exactly as the little anecdote we all just enjoyed, they're taking their kids and they're getting diagnosed because they're realizing that what their kids are, yeah, etc. So actually, that's the fastest growing group is middle-aged women. There is also a rise in middle-aged men, and there is a rise in young women as well, because those disparities are now being kind of edged out of the system. Those biases are being edged out of the system. There is a small growth if you look at particularly white young boys or young men. That is growing as well, but not very much. Like that growth is really kind of that growth is the kind of growth where we go, oh yes, we have increased awareness. And so actually, no, we can see that there are people that are kind of edge cases that we would have ignored 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But now what we know is if we ignore those edge cases, they just show up in mental health treatment in their 20s and 30s with substance misuse issues, with failed careers, with having completely missed out on an education or really struggling in their social lives. So let's not miss them as young
This
people.
is slightly anecdotal. It's slightly anecdotal, but when I think of some of the businesses and organisations, the employers I work with, they will say the number of graduates who are coming in who are neurodiverse is getting larger. You're saying it's actually middle age is the fastest growing, but it is still at that point as well.
The edge case, we're getting a lot more of what would have been edge cases. So the way that the diagnostic criteria have widened, what can kind of meet the clinical threshold for a diagnosis. But there is an end point to this. Like if you just think about it logically, if neurodivergence is divergence from the average, you start to get to 40, you can't get to 40, 50%. I hear this being bandied around, by 2040, 50% of Gen Z or Gen Alpha will be neurodivergent. I'm like, no, they won't. Because if 40 to 50% of them are neurodivergent, they're no longer neurodivergent. They are now the norm.
Yeah.
So, what is change and what is perfectly logical to be changing actually is neurocognitive expression, because our brains are mirrors of the society that we grow up in. The way our brains form is entirely driven by the experiences we have. And so as the experiences we have changed, things are going to change, like our attention spans, like our concentration spans, like our ability to sit still and concentrate, like our ability to handle the world. I mean, if you think about sensory sensitivity being one of the driving characteristics of autism, autistic brains basically have higher levels of sensory processing in the somatosensory cortex. And then less space in the frontal cortex to make sense of what all of that sensory input is making. So, lots and lots of sensory input, not enough space to work out what it means and sort it out. So quite kind of startle response reactions to overstimulation. So if that's what's happening in an autistic brain, that brain in the 80s would have gone to school by walking to school, probably quite quietly. So they would have had a very, a nice quiet walk every morning and every afternoon. They just the amount of data that they were processing was 5% of what it is now. The number of people living in cities versus the number of people living in kind of quiet rural areas, that's going to change the number of people who are struggling with that brain, with that cognitive style. So so our world is driving some of this as well. And as the world changes our neurocognitive expression, I expect that we will start evolving the way we define these conditions. About 15 years ago, I wrote a very challenging blog that I can't find anymore, but it was called Dyslexia, Reading as a Transition Technology, Discuss. And it was the idea that as we get phones that write for us and spell for us, and AI that you can basically now get to compose a letter for you, does dyslexia cease to be an issue? We're
Right.
spending 12 years of education teaching people to do something that is essentially an obsolete skill.
So the
Uh,
argument, the equivalent is a wheelchair user. As we get more automatic doors, ramps, level access, the impact is less.
yes,
The
yes,
Maybe,
environmental changes. Sorry, Phil.
maybe that,
exactly.
maybe that's a seamless link really into the kind of question I have, which is, so you've really helpfully explained what neurodiversity is, and I'm part of it, you're part of it, everybody's part of that. The
Hmm.
neurodivergent community, if there is such a thing as a community, are they disabled then? I mean, our podcast about disability. So are we saying that neurodivergent people are disabled, or are they just different?
I
Because
think it
one
can be
kind, you talked
both.
about minority, didn't you, and rights.
Yeah.
Clearly, if you're different from the norm,
Hmm.
then you might qualify to be defined as a disabled person. Now that's leads to a much bigger question, which is, do neurodivergent people want to be defined as disabled? That's a different ballgame.
Oh,
So
Phil,
where are
so
you?
many layers.
You see what
I
I mean?
love it.
We've only got about 40 minutes.
Mm.
I'm just interested, Nancy, in where you think then disability and neurodivergent people kind of
Mm,
intersect.
mm,
What's going
mm.
on there?
I mean, it's an overlapping Venn, is the way I would say that. And but I think it changes throughout your life and it changes on in the context you're in. I think for many neurodivergent people, we are very much within the social model of disability, which
Okay.
is that if we're in a school, so let's just take ADHD because this is a great example. So an ADHDer is disabled in an environment where they have to sit down and concentrate for 6 hours.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
most
get that.
schools are quite disabling for ADHDers. I stopped going to school when I was 14. I used to go on a Monday morning, I'd go and see my teachers, I'd find out what work I had to do for the week, I'd go home and do it. I could not sit in that school environment. However, the same brain style is absolutely brilliant if you are in the military and you're patrolling an area and your job is to be highly alert and looking out for things that are out of the norm. So, what we call distractibility in a school or in an open plan office, in the military, they call it ground force awareness, and it's an advantage.
Right.
And that's why you find so many ADHDers in the armed forces, but you also find them working as paramedics, working in the police, working in the fire service. So, you know, being in charge of nurseries where you've got to keep your eye on 20 little things that are running around all the time. You know, so you've got this, the context is king for a lot of neurodivergent people. That said, there are also a subset of neurodivergent people, and these are the people who would always have been diagnosed 30, 40 years ago before it was cool, where actually, no matter the context, there is still a level of disablement. And so I actually quite like the way the law treats disability in the Equality Act, where, you know, it's about your ability to perform normal everyday tasks. What are we calling a normal everyday task? How is that evolving? How is that changing? But within that definition, someone who is diabetic may or may not be disabled. So if they've got peripheral neuropathy and they can't feel their feet anymore, that is and they were a driver, that is disabling. They now need an adaptive car. However, if they're diabetic and they don't have any of those issues, they're probably not disabled. And on top of that, I think you do also have stigma. So you know, neurodivergence is kind of more cool. I don't think it's gay. I think it's moving past its cool phase, by the way. But anyway, it's been cool. So is that less stigmatizing than disabled? And therefore, do people want to not associate with disability? And that there is probably a pool of people for whom that's true. But I think there's also a lot of people who think they don't deserve to take resources. So that kind of zero-sum game that workplaces get into about disability. Well, we can't do this for everybody. We have to think about who's. It's like the deserving poor of the Victorian era, isn't it? Who are
Yeah.
the most deserving disabled people of our support? And so a lot of neurodivergent people feel like they're treading on people's toes if they're asking for support because they don't feel that they're as deserving of assistance. And I think, that was definitely part of my journey, something I had to come to terms with. And I can and can't associate. I can sometimes associate with disability. And interestingly, it was the Shaw Trust's Disability Power 100. The year that I did the first series of Employable Me, they gave that I was number 10 in their Power 100, or number 9. I think I was number 9 and Neil Milliken was number 10. And the guy from The Last Leg had
Yes.
won, and I love him. I absolutely love him, and I so was excited to go to the thing. And then when it actually came to the week, I had completely mismanaged my diary. I'd forgotten about some things I'd said yes to. I got to the Wednesday night and I realised I had absolutely no idea how I was going to get myself to London and back. I hadn't planned any childcare. I didn't know when my husband was coming home. I had forgotten to ask him. And I basically was so overwhelmed, I couldn't even, and I just went, I'm not going. That's it. I'm not going. So I sat down, I didn't go. And I spent the entire evening going, oh, and being really sad about it and upset about it, but just too overwhelmed to go, which is classic ADHD. And one of my friends said, and I said, I don't even think I should go. There's other people in that thing, and do I really deserve to be in this list? And and my friend Kate just said to me, Nancy, that's the thing about disability. Being disabled means you can't do things sometimes. That's literally what it is. And I was like, all right, fair.
I remember
Fair.
when I first met you, it was on Employable Me. And I
Yeah.
remember we talked about disability. It was either me or you, one of us, and you weren't at that disability space right then. It was
Yeah.
a professional expert with your neuro, and
Well, they didn't want me to talk about it because I said to them,
right,
I wanted to say, I am in this gang.
yeah, yeah,
I'm ADHD and ADHD, and they didn't want me to do it. They wanted me to hold a really big separation, and
yes,
I don't think they do that now.
I would agree.
I think that's one of the things that's changed. So that was 2016, 2015, 16, 17. I
Yeah.
think from 2021 onwards, they would have lapped up the fact that I was also an ADHD. Isn't that weird? I think that's a big change.
And a positive change. I like it.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you, this isn't an official question, but this is something that when I speak to organizations and they say, we've got these people coming in and there's maybe 20, 30% of the people want some sort of adjustments. And it's really tricky because of being neurodivergent. And they're saying it's really tricky because that's not how we work. Or if we give them 40 minutes a day, suddenly 30% of our staff taking 40 minutes a day is a real issue. And so I'm challenging, but I'm kind of saying, will we meet a crunch point where work has got to change because it doesn't work for enough people? Or is it going to be that other people who are neurodivergent, we're going to try and squeeze them in? Do you have a solution? You must get asked this question a
Oh
lot.
yeah. I get asked this question all the time. So first of all, I'd like to reframe adjustments. So I think reasonable adjustments have become stigmatized and we need to find some different language. So the purpose of an adjustment isn't to lower the standards of the work. The purpose of the adjustment is to assist that individual to meet the standards of the work, in which case they are productivity gains. So, here's the same adjustment framed two different ways, right? Um, I'm an autistic dyslexic, and I can't read my emails very well. I really struggle to read emails, so I'm going to need to always have the corner desk and to have my earphones on, and you're going to need to give me 2 hours 3 times a week for me to do my emails, because otherwise I won't be able to do them because I have these needs. That's way one. Number two, what I've noticed is when I have some dedicated time to focus on my emails, I get through twice as many in half the time, and I do a much better job of making contact with our customers, and my work's much more effective. So if it's all right with you, what I'd quite like to do is Monday, Wednesday, and Friday just spend two hours over there with my headphones on and just rattle through them, and then I'll have more attention for the rest of my work, and I'll be more effective. Is that all right with you? And it, I'm not saying it's the disabled person's job to do that reframe for the employer. I think it's the world of work. I think it's a joint process where we go, hold on a second, that's what we're saying here. What we're saying here isn't here, have some favors. What we're saying is what's the best way for you to be effective at your job? How do we create the conditions for you to shine, to thrive? Neurodiversity inclusion was all about going, hold on a second, there's a whole population. This is, I mean, this is why I got into it. This is what really enthused me about neurodiversity. Is I worked with people who were long-term unemployed, and I worked for Access to Work, and I just kept finding brilliant people who were completely underused, who were completely thwarted in their careers, people who were creative, interesting, funny, great problem solvers, who couldn't get past the entry level of a job because there were so many systems and processes that weren't actually necessary for the job that had blocked them out of it. And it was just such an enormous waste of their potential, both for our society and our economies, but also for them and it just felt like utter inefficiency to me. And I just thought this can't be right. You know, people are excluded, they are depressed, they are, you know, their lifelong earnings and financial stability is affected by this, for the want of some noise cancelling headphones. Can we not please just get this person working properly? So many of the things that work for neurodivergent people are cheap or free. They're
It's
cheap or
very
free.
interesting. It's very interesting, Nancy, because for the other non-neurodivergent people in that office, they're all given stuff to make them more effective. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, imagine you can only type with one hand because we've only got a one-handed keyboard. Well, that would disable half the workforce.
Hmm.
I've often thought, and I'd be interested in your thought about this. I love the idea that we've got to stop seeing reasonable adjustments as a nice to have.
Or a favor.
Yeah. Rather than saying it releases people's talent, which is a different way of putting it. And I want to just ask you around Simon's point, really, which is it then up to the organisation? Because I think Simon and I have spent many years of our lives helping disabled people of whatever hue to be more effective at getting what they want. Because
Mm.
I think that's the jewel in the crown. If you've got a
Hmm.
boss or an employer that's
Hmm.
interested and you are pushy enough and know how to push in a way which is respectful and whatever.
Hmm.
So what is the organization supposed to adapt then? Or am I supposed to adapt? Or actually, the obvious bloody answer is we both have to. And how does that work for a neurodivergent person to become more assertive, more effective, if that isn't their natural way of doing stuff?
It's hard and a lot. Neurodivergence as a minority rights advocacy community is in its infancy,
Yeah.
and I think we're at the kind of very grumpy, how very dare you have not already done this stage. And I think that's a natural stage as inclusion communities mature and get more effective and develop. You know, we're in, you know, think about the seven stages of grief. We're in the anger phase. So there's a lot of kind of, well, you ought to have done this and you should have known and you know, these things ought to have been provided for me. And, you know, I'm hearing from my HR customers things like, how much unprofessional behavior do I have to accept in order to be inclusive? It's like, oh, well, the answer is none, but then the nuance is how are we defining under unprofessional? And you know, I've got an ADHDer who says that they can't possibly meet deadlines or get to work on time because time is an issue for ADHDers. And I've got an autistic person who says that, you know, when they lose their temper and they shout at people, that's a meltdown and that's part of autism. So my colleagues just have to suck it up. And actually, none of those things are true. You know, so you have got people asking and advocating for what they want, and you've also got what they want currently being quite unrealistic for for a small but quite
Yes.
vocal minority of neurodivergent people. That narrative is causing a lot of tension, unhappiness. You know, I was with an employer yesterday who said that this one case that they had, the individual burnt through three line managers 2 of whom took time off work with stress. And in fact, their entire team either left or redeployed. So we can't have that. So we do need advocacy. We do need people standing up for their rights, but we also need, it's as you said, Phil, it's about meeting in the middle. What the pattern I see in workplaces, and this is not limited to neurodiversity or disability. This is just general in workplaces. We have a parent-child model of management.
Mm-hmm.
In Western cultures. So the manager is the parent and the employee is the child. So the manager is either a persecuting parent who demands everything be done their way, or the manager is a rescuing parent who says, oh, you find that difficult? Don't worry, I'll do that bit of your job for you. And then sort of takes it on in a kind of burning martyr style, and is essentially doing 25% of that person's job for them because they think that's what they have to do to be helpful and supportive. And then 6 months later, they completely burn out. They can't keep doing that. They then go to HR and HR go, well, you can't do that. That's ridiculous. They then come back to the employee who hasn't had to do any of their own report writing for the last 6 months and say, well, I'm sorry, you've got to do this report writing. And the employee is quite rightly going, well, hold on a second. Where was that made clear to me? And so, you've then got a bunch of, no one is happy in any of those circumstances. And that's where Genius Within has been a really interesting experience for me because we are majority neurodivergent. So in the game of whose pattern wins, is it the employer's pattern or the employee's pattern? What's interesting is both people in that equation are potentially have a protected condition. So whose pattern wins can never always be the managers or always be the employees. And even if it's not majority neurodivergent, other people have other needs. I had put this to I do some guest lecturing, quite a lot of guest lecturing, and I put this to an undergrad class. They were doing a module on neurodiversity, and I said, whose pattern wins? So if the pattern is about the way you prep for meetings, and the neurodivergent person wants a lot of preparation for meetings, they want an agenda, they need it 2 days before the meeting, and if they deviate from the agenda, that causes a lot of anxiety. So the manager's job is to never deviate from that agenda setting, and the manager doesn't usually work like that. They think much better on their feet, and they're quite spontaneous. Whose pattern wins? And they said, well, the employee's pattern wins. I said, okay, now, it's a hypothetical scenario. The employee is a young, white, neurodivergent, but otherwise able-bodied man, still living at home with his parents, doesn't have any financial difficulties, is saving up to leave home at the moment, building themselves a nice little nest egg, no other responsibilities. The manager is a single parent. At least one of the children that they're parenting is also neurodivergent and is not in school right now. And they're having a big battle with the school as to whether or not that kid should or shouldn't be going. They've got significant financial difficulties because they're raising disabled children alone. Now whose pattern wins? And they go, oh. And it's just not that easy to say, the employer must always default to the employee, or the manager must always default to the employee. What we want is 2 adults having a conversation where both parties are allowed to be fallible, and where the employee, if the manager has forgotten to do the meeting prep, the employee can say, oh, can we just take 5 minutes at the beginning of this meeting? I just need to be clear. And some of the points, actually, I'm going to have to go away and think about that. Can I come back to you in 2 days' time? And that
I'm going to come in, Nancy, because
yeah,
we've run out of time. But I like your answer. I wanted to talk about something that I don't think is spoken enough about. And you mentioned about it still being in its infancy and maybe the angry stage. With the social model, when that first came in, some of the objections were, all we're doing is blaming society environment, and we're not looking at our own impairment, which has an impact in itself. I was struck. I met someone who had autism, worked for a big corporate, and he said to me, I'm awesome at my job. They'll throw me a set of plans and I can tell them all the issues within 10 minutes. And it's unbelievable. He said, what they never see is when I go home and I have the deepest, darkest, difficult times. He was married with kids. And he said, I don't know if I'd still be around if I didn't have a family. But so this autism gives me a super skill, that superhuman bit. But he said the darkness and the difficulties I have with my life. Yes. And
spikes.
Is
Mm.
there a lack of conversation about the tough stuff? Is it because often I can see neurodivergent people say, these are all the extra things that I've got. Am I being a bit facetious?
No, I think you're articulating it perfectly. You know, it's not, is this a superpower? Is this a disability? It's both and. You know, it's not either or, it's both and. You know, my ability to think clearly and make decisions in a crisis, is, you know, it's up there with the best of the field generals of the World War II. My ability to get myself to the post office and remember to post something on time is is astounding. You know, and the that might sound like a flippant thing, but it's actually quite big for me. I kind of I carry this idea that I'm not sensitive, that I'm not that I don't care about people, because I forget birthdays, because I forget to ask people how they are sometimes, or if someone tells me that they're not okay, I go straight into problem solving mode and I don't spend time patting them on the head. So as an adult, I really I'm quite kind of intentional about remembering people's birthdays and making sure I send them presents. And I carry this anxiety that my social network is dependent on my ability to remember those things and to be nice and to ask those questions and to stay in sympathy mode for a lot longer than I'm comfortable with. And I have to work really, really hard at that. And when I fail at those things, it actually does have quite a big impact on my mental health. So it sounds flippant to talk about post offices, but I'm putting more effort into remembering people's birthdays and getting things to the post office to post to people than I am to coming up with a crisis management plan to handle the first 3 months of the pandemic.
But that's the difficulty with disability or neurodivergence,
Yeah.
the sense of failure or the
Yes.
sense of not being able to do something
Yes.
despite environment, attitudes, and so on. And that's a real toughie, and that may change. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an
So,
intersection of gender as well. I think the other thing people forget with neurodiversity are the intersections. So I stand at the intersection of female, gender and whiteness. So there's both privilege and discrimination in there. So, you know, as a female, if I don't send my in-laws birthday presents,
Mm.
I'm the one getting the shade, right? My
Yeah.
husband hasn't sent any of his family a birthday present in our entire marriage, and we're pretty gender swapped in many ways. I can read maps and he can listen. He does the ironing, and he knows where stuff is. So you know, but so even in that relationship, there's such a high weight on women's ability to be sociable and to be sensitive and you know, to take care of people. But if you think as well, you know, when I was at school and I didn't go to school for 2 years, and I had this agreement where I'd go and pick up my work on a Monday, do you think that would have happened if I was a black or brown kid? Like, absolutely not. You know, I would have been up in front of truancy people. They'd have had the council involved. You know, there's no way I would have got away with that. And actually, that was the only thing that allowed me to get my GCSEs. I got really good GCSEs going to school half a day a week. If I'd had to go to school every day, well, I wouldn't. I'd have been in a pupil referral unit. I can tell you that right now. I'd have been throwing things. But that so I think people's experience of neurodivergence is not equal through society at all. The cool superstar power stuff is the white males of the west coast of the USA, whose parents have paid for them to go to Stanford. You know, that model is great for neurodiversity, but
I think it
actually
also can be
there's a whole
parents.
world out there that
I think it
isn't
can be parents
experiencing
who
it
are
like that.
terrified of acknowledging that their child may have something and they have to couch it as a bit of, you know, we used to call to say people special. They were
Yeah,
special. So it's
yeah,
an equivalent. But that's part of infancy and
it
maturity,
is.
and you can have a little bit of difficulty as well as the good stuff.
I
Yeah,
suppose, the,
definitely.
Nancy, the last couple of minutes we've done I've found this really fascinating, and I'm wondering what you think is next here. What is the next big move that has to be done? You've only got about 3 minutes to tell me what it is. Um, You know, you've been working very hard for a number of years, and we now recognize neurodivergent people in a different way. We don't see it. I mean, I think Simon and I perhaps are in the privileged group who work for a living talking about this stuff. But you've been banging on about it for a long time now, and you have seen a lot of change. Things have improved. I know that to be true. But what's the next big thing, do you think, for the neurodivergent people that we've discussed or talked about today that really has to happen? Otherwise, we're in a real mess.
I think we've got to move out of the entitlement era into the agency era. So I think, and I think that's part of demedicalization.
Okay.
So what I'm still seeing is this situation where you have to prove that you have a medical condition before you can get adjustments. And so it's very much in that kind of let's battle for resources. And I think we have to move into a slightly different era where neurodivergent are encouraged to develop the skills, strategies, resources, accommodations that they can put in place themselves for themselves. And that's certainly what I'm trying to do. The book I wrote, Learning from Neurodivergent Leaders, it's a bit of a I'm so sorry, darling, but if you want to do leadership, you are going to have to work on yourself. So that time blind thing, it's not going to work. In leadership, you have responsibilities to other people, and you can't simply be someone who loses their temper a lot and someone who never gets back to people. You have to deal with those things, and you have to come up with strategies for it. So that, and then the technology that I've developed with the Genius Finder and the e-learning, that's all about self-development. None of it is about, here, let me wave a magic wand for you and send you something that's a shortcut to a skill that you don't have. Actually, everything in there is, here's how to develop this skill. If you're struggling with self-organization, here's 25 strategies of things you can practice to get better at that. If you're struggling with emotional regulation, here's 30 strategies of things you can practice to get better at that. And I think that's the level of empowerment that I want neurodivergent people to have. I don't want people to feel helpless, like they've been given a label that means that they can no longer expect to do any personal progress in certain areas.
I think that's a brilliant response, and it reminds me very much of some of the things I hear myself, or used to hear myself, saying to disabled people. That, if it takes you an hour to get dressed in the morning, like for me, for example, that's what it does. I'm a wheelchair user. It takes a long time to get up. I can't arrive an hour late. I have to get up earlier, don't I? Isn't that the deal? But when I get there better be a ramp and a toilet, because if there isn't, why did I get dressed? So I kind of hear echoes of that in the neuro. And I do agree with you. I think where neurodivergent people are at is where Simon and I were at 20 years ago. And we've been moving forwards, but we've never really known about this, have we? We used to call them all a bit eccentric or whatever, in my generation. It's been fascinating, Nancy. I've really enjoyed listening to you. And I hope that you've shone a light on a whole range of things here that we're all guilty of not accepting what people do, and we have flaws. But I'm brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's a total honor.
Excellent. I really meant that. I thought it was great.
I mean, I hope you did.
Yeah,
Well,
I enjoyed that. We
sometimes
could have debated so many of those
Yeah.
points for like 7 hours, couldn't we?
Yeah.
I'm sorry for jumping in. It was really hard because it was all good stuff, really good stuff. Thank you, Nancy. If it's all right with you, we do a little promo video.
Of course.